Medicine in Literature seminar series. It is presented by the Shame and Medicine project and hosted here at the Centre for the Conscious Environments of Health. And the seminar series is interrogating the connections between the experience of shame and its literary representation, and it's extending discussions that were initiated in the forthcoming Shame and Medicine thematic issue of Literature and Medicine. We're delighted to present Dr. Veronica Heney, who is an interdisciplinary medical humanities researcher at the Institute of Medical Humanities at Durham University. And she co-leads the Narrative Practices Lab, which is part of the Discovery Research Platform in Medical Humanities. And Veronica works on narratives and experiences of mental.
Thank you very much. I hope that everybody online can hear me and can see the slides, and if you can't, I'm trusting that you will say something in an excited manner into the chat and that somebody who isn't me will fix the tech. I'm really, really pleased and delighted to be here today. I'm really grateful for the invitation. I'm going to talk about some data that came out of my PhD that I finished a couple of years ago at the Wellcome Centre here under the supervision of Exeter's very own Laura Salisbury and Felicity Thomas, two wonderful supervisors. And as sort of Catherine mentioned, this talk is drawn from a paper that will hopefully, fingers crossed, soon be published as part of the special issue of Literature and Medicine that was edited as part of the Shame and Medicine project, which is really exciting. So I today am going to talk about shame, self-harm and fiction, and particularly the relationship between those things. So I'm going to get started. And what I will actually the thing that I should really say first is that both the PhD and my current post are generously funded by the Wellcome Trust, to whom I really owe just about my whole career. So my sincere thanks to them. My slide isn't moving. There we go. Okay, here we go. So the shameful nature of self-harm is often simply taken for granted. There's certainly plenty of evidence that people in general regard self-harm as shameful, and that those of us who have self-harmed often feel shame about it. But this often feels so self-evident that we can stop paying attention to the way that self-harm becomes shameful, which is what this talk sort of tries to remedy a little, specifically by exploring the role that fiction and cultural discourse plays in this process. Sally Munt has described shame as a sticky emotion to which other emotions might easily be attached. This talk suggests shame's stickiness also functions to bring together, associate, or attach subjects, both fictional and real, with and to one another. So what I'm doing here is I am not theorizing shame. Rather, I'm interested in thinking about the ways in which shame might move through or be invoked and manifested by fictional texts in relation to self-harm. And I will do that by drawing on interview data from 17 interviews with people with experience of self-harm that I conducted as part of my PhD. In the interviews, a wide variety of fictional texts were discussed in relation to shame, with basically no single text being mentioned with particular frequency. So today, instead, I'm going to talk about a text which, to me, both conveyed and invoked shame intensely, both in its content and in, frankly, how bad it is. So this is Tim Blake Nelson's 2015 film Anaesthesia, which is little known for very good reason. Please do not take this as a sign that you should go and watch this film. You have better things to do 2 hours of your life. The film is a multi-storyline drama tracing interconnections between a wide cast of characters, one of which is Sophie, who we'll be following. Sophie's a promising graduate student who is self-harming. She's played by Kristen Stewart, a fact which is interesting for reasons I don't have time to elaborate on, but do, if it's interesting to you, ask me in the Q&A about it. So I'm going to begin by establishing two things pretty quickly. Firstly, that in the study that I did, participants didn't actually feel that self-harm was inherently shameful. So this point that I made at the beginning, that we take it for granted that self-harm is shameful, this really suggests that we shouldn't be doing that. From the quotes on the slide, hopefully you can see that shame's presence or absence might be dictated by culture, geography, relationality, or simply personal experience. whereby other practices are experienced as shameful, in comparison to which self-harm shame almost disappears entirely. So second, from this point, I want to just briefly highlight some of the specific ways that self-harm came to be understood as shameful. Yes, good, okay. And to note specifically from these quotes that it often wasn't to do with the physical act of self-harm, but to do with the characteristics and indeed often the character traits that it was associated with. So if we look at the quotes on this slide, to me, there's a really striking convergence in what participants identified as shameful. There's a repeated language of brokenness, of weirdness, of being manipulative or dirty or gross. And this was also interesting to me because this language, which you can see here, appeared at moments in other interviews in such a way that to me suggested that its invocation might hint at the presence of shame, even when the emotion wasn't explicitly identified. So basically, it led me to believe that this language of brokenness, of dirty, of grossness was invoked when people felt shame about something, even if they weren't saying to me, I felt ashamed. And there's interesting literature about the difficulty of saying you feel shame, which I just will not get into, but it raises interesting questions. These varied comments present an intriguingly consistent picture of the type of self-harm or self-harming subject which is experienced or understood as particularly shameful. I'm interested in the tenor of this weirdness, which seems to be associated with the failure of being broken, the abjection of being dirty, the moral collapse of being manipulative or indulgent, and the callous solipsism of being immature or histrionic. This is not a universal shame, or rather, it is not a shame which functions universally. This shame is specific. It is a shame that is enacted through characteristics which are not necessarily inherent to self-harm, but are associated so closely and repeatedly with it that they come to seem inherent. And importantly, this association is in part accomplished through narrative. And I'm going to turn now to anaesthesia for the first time. And as I do that, I want to give a quick note about the discussion going forward. I have taken it for granted that given the title of this talk, people will expect that I will be discussing self-harm. I want to give a quick note that in the later discussion of this film, there will be an image of self-harm scars, and that we will be discussing a particular method of self-harm, and that I'd like to encourage anybody who feels like this is tough or tricky or might raise something difficult to feel absolutely free to just leave the room and the Zoom as suits you. Okay, so to think about how this association of characteristics with self-harm is accomplished, I'll talk about anaesthesia. So the self-harming graduate student, Sophie, is introduced to the audience, and this is partway through the film because lots of other things are happening. She's introduced to the audience sitting alone in the university cafeteria. Another student walks past and casually snags the seat opposite her, to which Sophie responds angrily, challenging him on why he didn't ask her permission to remove it. The interaction escalates, and in every back and forth, Sophie seems more absurd, more unsociable, more self-indulgent in her refusal to let go of a minor inconvenience. Although the other very bro dude student is a bit rude, Sophie's response seems outsized, such that when he responds angrily, it's hard to entirely sympathize with her, as she refuses to either accept his apology or simply let the interaction go. And to me, watching this, there's a compelling match with the precise dimensions of shame identified by the participants in my study: weirdness, brokenness, immaturity, overaction, manipulation. That Sophie is a character who self-harms will not be revealed to the audience for another 20 minutes. And yet the traits self-harm is associated with are already well established. Sophie is already shameful. Her self-harm simply falls into place within this. This, to me, is the creation of a type. So a self-harming character becomes shameful not simply because they engage in a practice or act of self-harm, but because they are the type of character or person who would self-harm. So Blanche in this quote talks about the TV show American Horror Story, which some of you may remember with some horror. And she was like, oh my God, if people see this and they think that this is only what self-harm is. She said, I don't want anyone to associate me with this like bullshit, this like edgy indie teen bullshit. I was like, this is embarrassing. I just think this is such an interesting set of comments, and that they really demonstrate the way that shameful depictions of self-harm are not mere descriptions, containers of information. Rather, they are vectors. They both connect and transmit. Kay Mitchell talks about the troubling intersubjectivity and transmissibility of shame, which Shields and Walsh suggest potentially rips through the contours of the subject, throwing into disarray the formal distinctions between inside and outside. And I've like read that out loud, but hopefully that quote is about to be on the slide. There we go. So in participants' comments, the boundaries of the subject are becoming blurry as reader, viewer, and character become inextricably entangled. Yet there is also a demarcation. Because to me, if we bring those comments together with those on the earlier slides, wherein self-harming subjects were explicitly delineated as weird and non-normative, we can see that while shame functions in one direction to associate, it also simultaneously works to mark out. Through becoming associated with a particular self-harming type, individuals are marked out as different, as weird, as broken, as solipsistic and manipulative and immature. Their existence as individuals, even as subjects, ceases, and they become simply one among many, an example of a category, and specifically a shame-laden category. So I think that this too is explicated through Sophie's character in Anaesthesia. Oh. Well, I had somewhat hoped that I had screenshots of this, but I do not. So you will just have to imagine what this looked like in the film, and trust me. Just to talk about it quickly, I think that there's an interesting example of how viewers might be drawn into relation with her without gaining a sense of her subjectivity. So we connect with her, but not necessarily as a full person. So it's clear as we are introduced to her in that first scene that she is the character upon whom this narrative thread centers. The camera pans across the faces of other students in the cafeteria laughing and talking before coming to focus upon her face as she sits alone. She is amongst her peers, but not part of them. As the uncomfortable incident over the chair plays out, students in the background of the shot seem increasingly to be aware of what is happening. Yet when the young man shouts at her, no one intervenes, no one checks on her, no one helps her to pick up the chair. Sophie packs up her books and begins to leave. The camera cuts to her sitting in a bathroom stall alone. Sophie has been marked out, but in such a way that leaves her isolated from both the characters around her and from viewers. We can hear her breathing as the camera looks at her, but there's no opportunity to know what she's thinking or how she feels. Rather than facing flat towards her, the camera angle is voyeuristic. It peers down so that we can see the top of her head more than her face. We have been looking at Sophie, but not in such a way that we might really see her, or at least see her subjectivity. Indeed, not in such a way that suggests she has much subjectivity to see. She has become almost object-like, simply an example of a type. And to me, when we think about this, it's easy to imagine that to be connected to Sophie, as to other characters who self-harm, is insulting, frustrating, even inaccurate. The text created a social type, a structure of knowledge into which self-harm and all self-harming subjects might be placed, as was felt by the participants in the study. Through narrative's ability to establish social relationality, their ability to exist or to be recognized as full human subjects diminish, as they came to share in characters' positioning as object-like examples of a shameful type. Now I'm going to hope that this will take me back to where my slides are, thank goodness. So what I then thought is that this shameful type seems particularly connected to visibility. So as we can see in Margaret's account, she talked about a self-harming character who was seen totally from the outside by the narrative. And actually she's talking about a novel by Angela Carter. My deep apologies to both Angela Carter and Angela Woods, and that they should take it as a compliment that I associate two such great people with one another. And I need to know fewer Angelas. So Margaret's talking about this framing and the fact that the character was in her early 20s. She said, I did kind of equate it with how people might have seen me at that age as well. And I felt quite a lot of guilt and quite a lot of shame. And she came back to this sort of topic a bit later, saying that she felt that the text invoked how people around me perhaps felt looking at me. And it will come as like everybody in this room and probably in Zoom as well will be like, okay, so far so straightforward. Visibility is frequently foregrounded in theoretical literature on shame. Kay Mitchell suggests that shame itself is so much a matter of visibility and concealment. Ruth Lees suggests that shame is identical to exposure. We mostly take it as read. Being shamed is the experience of being revealed as in some way failed or flawed. It is not necessarily the failure itself which is shameful. It is the visible uncovering of that failure by or in front of others, whether real or imagined. So Lou talked about the film 13, which included a narrative around being discovered, she said. She suggested that there was a tendency for fiction to depict a character self-harming and then to depict an intervention and then to depict cessation. She said that these sorts of structures didn't encourage her to ever talk to people about her self-harm. She said, because the stories that I see, it's a secret and it's something shameful. So here there's a bit of a difference from what we've been talking about before. Rather than being invested with shame through association with other shameful traits, here, self-harm becomes shameful through the narrative structure within which it is placed. Self-harm is shameful because it is discovered, because what was secret has been exposed and seen to be unfit. This could be kind of circular. It can equally be argued that self-harm must be discovered because it is shameful and therefore was initially hidden. We're like going in circles here. My point is not to suggest a sequential logic. I'm not trying to make an argument about what comes first. I'm trying to emphasize the mutually reinforcing nature of such a construction. The more self-harm is associated with secrecy, the more it is inevitably understood as shameful, no matter what comes first. In Anaesthesia, the moment of discovery is self-prompted. So unlike a lot of other fictional depictions of self-harm, where there's a moment where somebody is walked in on in a bathroom or getting changed, that is like a fairly popular trope. So in Anaesthesia, she's doing the revealing herself, but it is, I think, no less a moment of uncovering. So in the midst of a somewhat abstract conversation about philosophy with her advisor, Professor Zarrow, Sophie stands up and without saying anything, pulls up her sleeve to show the scars on her arm, and then pulls down her jeans to reveal the scars on her thighs. A sense of exposure pervades the scene, in part because of Professor Zarrow's response as he asks, "Why have you done this to yourself, Sophie?" Even when said kindly, as I think the film really wants us to believe that that is said, this question to me implies judgment. Sophie has done something unacceptable and must explain herself. For all that she chose to share her self-harm, she has still been exposed. This is made even more explicit by the doubling of exposure here. To show her scars, Sophie undresses. To expose the scars is to expose flesh, to come dangerously close to nakedness. In the scene, the silence as she does so, the jerky awkwardness of her movements, anybody who's ever seen Kristen Stewart in anything can imagine that pretty well, I think, emphasizes the inappropriateness of undressing in her advisor's office. This enacts the way that self-harm is inherently exposing. because making its presence known often involves a literal or metaphorical becoming naked. Here we see the precise dynamics of self-harm's discovery, through which it is associated with inappropriate, uncomfortable vulnerability, and both literal and emotional nakedness, and thus social failure or unacceptability. So, and this, I think, raised some interesting questions about nakedness that actually came up in the interviews, which I thought was really fascinating and hadn't necessarily expected. So as we can see here, there's a long quote on the slide, which I won't read all of, from Rosa, who described a novel where self-harm, she said, she was talking about a specific novel, but also talked a bit generally. And she said, self-harm is always shown maybe in scenes where they are naked. And she suggested that maybe that links to sex or links to being vulnerable. And she really had this strong sense that if a book or film was in some way connected to self-harm, she said, it'll have a sex scene in it or a link to saying about sex. And although I've read and watched a lot of things about self-harm, and there are a couple of exceptions to this, I think it's a really insightful observation. She thought that this might link to a lingering sense that sex, especially outside of marriage, has been condemned in the same way that people still think self-harm is wrong, morally wrong. While her invocation of morality echoes the sense of judgment that I felt was present in that scene in Anaesthesia, her comments to me also suggest the presence of shame. The shame of self-harm is in some way the shame of sex, of embodiment out of place. To confess self-harm is to confess a fact of embodiment. It brings matters of the body to the fore. It is to reveal a truth about your body, to make it visible, whether literally or figuratively. It is perhaps unsurprising that within such a structure, shame seems impossible to avoid. So in Anaesthesia, to share her secret, Sophie must make herself vulnerable twice over, and thus is shamed twice over, by the act of self-harm itself and by the way she chooses to make it visible, exposing, we might think, perhaps more than she needs to. Once the scars on her arm are apparent, there's no narrative or practical need to show those on her thighs, and yet she chooses to pull down her trousers. Over and over, the scene lingers in excess, in superfluity. It's not just the watch Sophie exposes that is shameful, but the act of exposure itself, a sudden jolt into intimacy, where previously in the scene there was academic philosophical discussion of precepts. It's, as an academic, don't watch the film and don't watch the scene, but it is really funny to see what people think happens in academic discussions. This is a shift from a mode of intellect to one of embodiment. And the shift is jarring, it's deliberately jarring, emphasized through the scene's shot construction. As Sophie pulls away her clothes, the camera moves to show close-up shots of the scars, as if to double the exposure, to emphasize the visuality of what she has done. The politics of this, of course, extremely complex in given many experiences of self-harm wherein there is no visible after effect. I will not get into that right now. These zoomed in shots are intercut with an initial wider shot of her whole body as she prepares to undress, once again locating her firmly in this academic office setting with like big bookshelves, no shared offices, open plan, hot desking in this universe. And then later, a shot then pans up to show her hunched over, her hair covering her face, yet with her thighs bare. And all these shots of Sophie are interspersed with shots of Professor Zarrow, who remains unmoving, shown in two different aspects, but both capturing him sat firmly behind his desk, retaining his professional mode. He looks at her. She is looked at. She is shamed. He and we, the viewers, sit in judgment. We are embarrassed on her behalf. Through positioning self-harm as that which traffics in exposure, it is reinforced as that which is shameful. And moreover, that which is practiced by people who are embarrassing, who are exhibitionist, who exist and position themselves as objects to be looked at and judged. It is to me of little surprise that representing self-harm through this mode of exposure might be felt to position self-harming subjects reading or watching such texts as similarly shameful. So in concluding, because I don't want to go on for too long, I want to leave time for discussion. I want to note just one final complexity to the relationship between shame and self-harm and fiction. Specifically through exploring the possibility that attempts to remove shame might instead simply shift or even proliferate. So, while as our very own Luna Dolezal comments, the relationship between shame and stigma remains under-theorized, or perhaps remained under-theorized before the very excellent Shame and Medicine project, which now we're done, I think we've theorized, we're set now. For the purpose of this paper, I note that social structures through which certain acts become stigmatized might also initiate feelings of shame. So writers, public figures, and researchers frequently frame narratives of shame as acceptable only if they end in recovery, and indeed even suggest that discourses of hope and recovery might hold the potential to reduce the stigma of self-harm. And there's been, I think, some really important criticism, both of general trends of mental health storytelling and of the valorization specifically of recovery narratives. So, and this reference will be at the end. Anna O'Donnell, Lydia Sapuna, and Liz Brosnan have written about the ways that as certain stories or testimonies are invited into professional spaces, usually those with narratives of recovery which feature redemption for healthcare workers, they suggest, certain stories are excluded, those told by survivors who are deemed to be too mad or too angry. Such concerns alert us to the possibility that seeking to tell narratives which reject self-harm's shame or shamefulness might result in sanitized portrayals, which simply re-stigmatize the forms of self-harm which fall outside of these narrow bands of acceptability. I think we can take as self-evident that this is particularly significant given the ways that acceptability and its exclusions so frequently act unevenly across structures of race, gender, and class. And the risks of positioning recovery specifically as a norm was reflected in Lou's experience, who said, I can't think of a film actually where there's a character who uses self-harm who then, by the end of the film, normally they have stopped. And she talked a bit about that sometimes it was good to be able to feel hope. But then she said, actually, it's not that helpful because it's fantasy. And the flip side of that hope is the potential shame and kind of confusion around not fitting into what the story is telling me, that she herself was still self-harming, even after a point at which she might have assumed that her story would have come to an end. And that there was something really difficult about what it meant to watch these narratives where she was being told that it would end, and it was not ending. So Lou's point is not that one narrative ends with recovery, but that they all do. There is a sense of the significance of repetition. Over time, over successive films or TV shows or books, Lou has engaged with many narratives of self-harm and has found only one form of conclusion or resolution that seems to be acceptable. While we might consider individual narratives and the narrative structures through which they invest recovery with a normative force, what becomes even more significant is the way in which repetition functions. To encounter one narrative's version of a happy ending is to encounter a possibility. When every narrative shares the same vision of how a story of self-harm should end, specifically that self-harm itself should end, there is no longer possibility, but necessity. Within such endless repetition, there is very little solace to be found for anyone whose own narrative does not align with such a requirement. And Anaesthesia, to return one last time, undeniably aligns perfectly with this so-called acceptable narrative structure. Even within a very small number of scenes, no more than honestly 4 or 5 across the whole film, Sophie's narrative remains that of an arc of recovery. There's no story so short that you shouldn't have recovered by the end of it. The structure is basically impossible to avoid. The final image we see of Sophie is on the street outside her apartment with Professor Zarrow. At his prompt and comment that you made me a promise, she reluctantly pulls out her curling iron, which she's been using to burn herself with, from her rucksack and hands it over to him. In some ways, the scene a little shies away from the certainty of cessation, with Sophie sort of saying out loud, I can just get another one. I can use cigarettes. But nevertheless, she does give up her tool, and its significance, the weight of this, is evident in the scene's physicality, as we see a long moment in which they both hold the curling iron, never doubt Kristen Stewart's ability to hold on to an awkward pause, in which she holds on without relinquishing it. At his admonition, he says, "Sophie," she sighs and releases her grip, saying, "Thank you." The comment has the tone of a commitment, of the very promise the professor initially invoked. It is as if the necessity of cessation is impossible to avoid. If Sophie can recover and cease self-harming after merely 2 conversations and 4 scenes, what does that mean for those whose self-harm is ongoing? Yet, in many ways, for my purposes at least, the significance of this scene is not Sophie at all, or at least not just Sophie. The importance lies in the way that Sophie becomes simply one in an endless train of characters who self-harm and whose happy ending is recovery. So talking about our relation to the norm, Sarah Ahmed uses the metaphor of a path, saying, "A path is made by the repetition of the event of the ground being trodden upon. The lines that direct us are in this way performative. They depend on the repetition of norms and conventions, of routes and paths taken, but they are also created as an effect of this repetition." I would argue that recovery from and cessation of self-harm is one such path, one that is so well trodden that the story simply slips along it, as Sophie's does. Through this very ease, the shame of falling outside of that, of being off the path, intensifies. In trying to contain Sophie's shame, in promising its end and future absence, the narrative defers or transmits that shame. The shame doesn't disappear through its resolution. Rather, it is simply left, waiting for those of us to whom it belongs to pick it up. Those of us who are unrecovered, who strayed from the path of recovery, or even just those who might stray from that path in the future. We might take it for granted that the point of narratives around self-harm, that what every person naturally desires is to make self-harm as unshameful as possible. And indeed, a lot of my own comments today and the accounts of the participants that I've quoted have been oriented towards that position. But I don't think that means it's universal. And I think this next quote is really helpful in thinking about how and why. Siobhan, when I asked her what a good representation of self-harm might be, said, and I'm going to read this in full because it sticks with me, this quote. She said, "The things that stick out for me is when I've either been scared as a result or ashamed as a result of self-harm. I think to represent it, it's all those things. It's the walking to A&E, at 3 a.m. in the morning because you can't stop a cut bleeding. Or it's like developing disgusting rashes because you're not like watching your wounds, or you're deliberately like not taking care of them. The parts of self-harm that felt most urgent and real to her were the parts that were shameful, because shame is an important emotion. For all that it is an emotion we might instinctively draw back from, that doesn't mean that we must or should follow that instinct. When I watch Sophie in Anaesthesia, I want to turn away. I want to say that this is too embarrassing to watch, to look at. I want to say that this is inaccurate, that it gets it wrong, and that besides, it is a bad film. Yet I am drawn to her as well, to her awkwardness and her attempts to explain something that is hard. I am pulled into the language of her body, which communicates her distress when the somewhat trite words of the script seem to fail. The many aspects of shame with which this viewing experience is invested gives the film some form of meaning, to me, that is hard to explain. Suffice to say that for all the film's frustrations and failures, the ways it is hackneyed and sentimental and self-satisfied, I am not certain that those failures are failures of too much shame. Sophie's shame, the shame of being Sophie, and the shame of watching Sophie, this spiraling multiple shame that so easily blends together, makes me want to flee, but it makes me want to be close to her as well, because I would never feel that shame so intensely if it wasn't also my own. if I wasn't invested in these practices and these ways of feeling and being, in what it means to be a person who self-harms. If I didn't have care for that, and therefore for her, then it wouldn't matter. Participants in the study, I hope you can see, described shame's presence somewhat ambivalently. While it was clearly a significant affect or emotion, their comments neither reflected a belief that self-harm itself is inherently shameful, nor described a simple process whereby they saw a representation of self-harm, identified its similarity to their own life, and felt shame. Rather, they repeatedly experienced an engagement with a fictional text whereby the narrative positioned them as self-harming subjects in relation to self-harm's shamefulness through specific characteristics, actions, and genres. It is through this positioning that they felt shame, a shame that suggests a judgment of themselves and their actions they didn't necessarily accept or agree with, and yet still felt the pain of. In understanding this process and the specific narrative tools or aesthetic devices by which it is accomplished, we can see more clearly how shame functions in relation to self-harm. Through this understanding, we can perhaps, I hope, as Siobhan invites us, come to be close to self-harm, close to its multiplicity, its ambivalence, and even its excess, both in fiction and in our own lives. These are some of the references I drew on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Veronica. That was so really insightful and such a brilliant talk. Thank you. I wonder whether we could.
Shall I exit this and then we can see people?
Why don't we do that? Yes.
Although actually what we can see is me, which is really terrible. So how do we stop this?
Are you perhaps spotlighted?
Spotlight. Do I click view? Gallery, what about this?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, oh yes, wonderful.
Or
we're both in.
no.
So perhaps if those on Zoom, if they have any questions, we put them in the chat box. I don't know if there's any already.
Yeah. So anyone?
Is there any there?
They're on.
I'm sorry about the sound, Pony.
Unless if anyone else in the room has
You take one in, one out.
one.
I sort of have a question, but I have a sort of slightly wonder whether it's actually in your thesis, and I'm just sort of remembering it because it's such an amazing amazing thesis and a really brilliant paper. It's so nice to have you back here, Veronica. So I had a sort of association, as a psychoanalyst would say, when you were talking, and you were talking about one of the things that shame does. And I was thinking about a mature student I worked with who had lived for a long time with mental health. Well, she would have said madness, actually. That was the word that she always preferred. And self-harm had been involved in that. And she'd been talking about medical records and had wondered about her medical records. There had been times when she'd wanted to get access to her own medical records and had been refused. And when she finally did get access to her medical records, she said it was like a blizzard had gone through them. She said they were completely disorganized. They were very, some things have been kind of pulled out and redacted. This is over a long period of time, like decades. And she said in comparison, her husband's medical records gave a real account. It's like, knee surgery, 1984, it's very, very ordered. And there was something about the way she described it, which was very evocative, but there was a sense somehow that her madness, as she would call it, and her self-harm there was an idea of it making a scene, as opposed to giving an account. And I wondered about this sort of idea of, because that's often one of the sort of accusations, isn't it? That, self-harm is a way of somebody making a scene. And I was wondering about the relationship between a scene and an account in how we might think and what shame does in those in those relations. So yeah, that was a bit of a ramble.
No, but it was a great ramble. I think that's really interesting. The question of medical records, very fraught in many directions. But that specific difference between an account and a scene is, I think, the thing it makes me think of is there was a bit in my thesis where I talked a bit about like what was spectacular. And one of the criticisms people often made of representations of self-harm is that it over-dramatized. And that came along with a critique of glamorization, which is a bit more perhaps about aesthetics and like people being very like young and thin and white. It's what I call the Effie from Skins conundrum. Poor Laura was introduced, I'm sure, to Skins through my thesis, so we can all feel sorry for her.
I'd heard of it. I didn't watch it.
Well, you were better off. But I think that this critique of over-dramatization, which people felt really strongly, I don't necessarily feel like I solved it through thinking about that, but it occurred to me that there is something particularly difficult about representing self-harm, because any representation of it is a scene. Like, it's a scene, you've filmed it, like you've written about it, you've written the scene. And that self-harm in sort of, I hate the word inherently, because it never seems to be true, but like self-harm is so fundamentally understood to be spectacular. It's about like, there's shock and there's drama. And I think the important thing is that that is how it is understood. It is often not experienced as that. Like lots of people in the study talked about how self-harm felt really mundane in their own life. It felt mundane. And the thing that was difficult when everybody responded to them, it was this huge like, oh, well, now we've got a whole thing and we've got to deal with this whole thing. And how have you created this whole thing? Obviously, we're a little sorry for you, but really what we're stressed about is having to handle this big drama. And I think it does something specific to the nature of fiction, that like fiction itself intervenes or mediates that in a way that is really fraught. Because you're always like grasping for realism, but the more you grasp for realism, the more it's like, well, you're over dramatizing it. You've made this really gritty, and the grittier you make it, it's like, it's the 13 reasons why difficulty. Like the more explicit and gritty you are, or like the claim you make to being explicit and gritty, the more it feels like you're making a palaver of this. And I do think that that critique ties into, it is a shame, it's shameful to make a scene, but it is perhaps we'd say it's shameful to be at the center of a scene. What is really shameful is to make it deliberately. And that's the implication about self-harm, is not just that like, this is very big and inconvenient. It's that you have deliberately put yourself in a place where you create something big and inconvenient. I will say one last thing about this. I think that then that perception gets read onto things in really dangerous ways. And I read a paper recently where the authors, I think, trying really hard to do some interesting analysis, talked about the testimony of a mother who would sometimes go into her daughter's room and would find something along the lines of evidence of self-harm. So like maybe tissues or plasters or something. And she said really clearly, I feel like my daughter was trying to communicate something with me. She was trying to show me something by leaving this out. What she didn't talk about is the fact that like it was her daughter's room and she went into it. Her daughter has made a scene. She's like communicated something, but actually her daughter just did something in her room and then walked out of her room. And she didn't say to her mother, please go into my room right now. Her mother entered her room. And I think that there is something to that about the way in which it becomes impossible to be a person who self-harms, who isn't making a scene. You can put a nice picture on Instagram of yourself in a short sleeve top, and they will take it down. And I think that response is in part a response that it enacts shame. It shames people. So there is both shame in the thing and there is an enactment of shame. That was a long and rambling answer. Your question was just too interesting.
Thank you.
I can answer Tony's question about participation. Yes, so I don't know if you were here, Tony, right at the beginning, I did show a breakdown of all the participants, and there was one man did participate, and one genderqueer person, and I was very grateful to the lovely man who participated. I think there's probably two things at work. There's a lot of uncertainty about demographics in terms of how many men are self-harming or aren't self-harming, what the proportions are. Historically, it's seen as something that women do more frequently. I think that's kind of up for debate, but I do think one of the things that frames that is like, historically, the things that women do that are harmful to the self are described as self-harm. And there are lots of things that men might do that wouldn't be described as self-harm. So people in this, or that they perhaps wouldn't themselves describe as self-harm. So people in this study talked a lot about things like, oh, well, you really understand self-harm to be like self-cutting or self-burning, but if somebody punches a wall repeatedly, and they like hurt their hand or their knuckles, and you might see that, nobody would say that person self-harms, even though the participants in my group in this study really did understand that as maybe self-harming. So I think there's a question about, I use the term self-harm in all my recruitment materials. And there's a question about who self-identifies into that category of being a person who has self-harmed. And I also think that it was a small study and a PhD study, and I didn't have as many third sector contacts at the beginning as I do now. And so I was really reliant on social media, and that was the way it went. I think I was really pleased. And in the context of self-harm, it is quite nice to even have one man who participates, and I was really delighted, although I was delighted by all my participants equally, I should say. But I think that in the future, and if one had a bit more time and it was a bit more like established in the field and in the third sector, one could do a better job of recruiting in a targeted way, which I didn't manage to do. So I'll hold my hands up to that.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Tony.
That's all right. So I'm getting broadband issues here. I thought that was really, really interesting, the talk that I want to manage here, but I will look forward to hearing the recording. I was very interested by your point just now about punching a wall, or maybe driving too fast and stupidly, or my only experience of self-harm is as a teenager, a very sort of angry, angsty, insecure teenager, and that was very clearly trying to.
Oh, Tony, I'm so sorry, we've lost you in the middle of that sentence. Oh no. We've been cursed by the internet. I often feel this way. Tony, are you back with us? We lost you.
It's on mute now.
Oh yeah, he is. All right. I won't answer Tony's question because I feel like I didn't hear the end of it, so I'll do a bad job. But I will say instead that it's a really complex and fraught question. Oh, Tony, I'm so sorry, we lost most of that. And I'm not sure if you're with us again now, actually.
Yes, I think, Veronica. But yeah, thank you so much for your talk.
Well, thank you, Tony, for your question. Let's talk about it more at another time. And I'll say that the question of what self-harm is or isn't is extremely fraught. It's gendered, it's racialized, it's classed. And what I don't get into here, but actually did mention briefly in my thesis elsewhere, is that shame intersects across that there are some forms of self-harm that are understood to be more shameful. And some that I was at a meeting where so-called self-harm researchers described a specific form of self-harm as glamorous, and I really did not enjoy that. So no further comment, but I think that's really important. If there isn't somebody imminently, oh, Fred, go for it.
I can ask one, yeah. So quick comment first, if that's all right. That was such a good talk. Thank you. I really like that. Wondered if you'd ever read any of Patricia Hill Collins' stuff on controlling images, because that's I found that really useful in terms of thinking about how these cultural scripts kind of pull us into their stereotypes and all of the sort of shamey stuff that does. Second very quick comment is that I feel like this is the kind of history stuff.
Mhm.
I feel like there's like when self-harm and like attempted suicide are kind of disentangled from like failed attempts, like failed suicide, being seen as failed suicide. So much of it is around communication, but also around like manipulation of the environment. Like it's seen as a way of predominantly women getting what they want in a way that's gendered and I think quite nasty.
Mm.
So I think that's quite a big source of where some of the shame comes from. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that and what those kind of legacies are. But my question, sorry, is you were kind of you talked a bit about destigmatization as something which doesn't get at the more serious experiences. I'm interested in that because I think it's also frequently just not attentive to shame at all.
Mhm.
And it results in some things which both like heighten the burden of shame and kind of end up obliterating the only kind of meta narratives that actually might alleviate shame in terms of the way it kind of sanitizes questions of power and exploitation and things like that. I wonder if you can sort of situate, I mean, can you talk to me more about self-harm and destigmatization? And is there a kind of a critique of neoliberal destigmatization, particularly that's available through your work?
I think that's probably, in some ways, being able to really fully answer that question is a bit beyond the scope. In part, like it's beyond what that research can answer because there's such a focus on fiction. And so a lot of the sites of this like campaign of destigmatization are like big public health messaging campaigns that don't quite come into it. I would say two quick things. I would say in the context of this work, the place to look is young adult novels, which are often really about like destigmatization, but specifically through teaching people the right thing to do. And I have a critique in the PhD of those as like really functioning quite badly and upsettingly along those lines. And I think, I had a second point, it's gone straight out of my head. Public health narratives. The one other thing that comes to mind is this question of like attention seeking. And it didn't come up loads, but it was something that came up just enough to make me think there's a string there to pull on, which is that the big accusation against self-harm is that it's attention seeking. And the big rejoinder to that is, no, it's not. The rejoinder that doesn't get made, but I personally would choose to make all the time is like, yeah, you should give people attention. Yeah, I'm really sorry. I don't think it's a bad thing at all to need attention. And sometimes that happens through a reframing of like, it's not attention seeking, it's care seeking. And that's fine too. I think it's fine to want attention. I don't think that's bad. And I think that if somebody is telling you they need more attention, they're telling you something important about what's missing in their life. And I think that is the pushback we should do. And we're not doing that. We are saying self-harm is not attention seeking at all. And specifically related to the question of shame, what people say is self-harm is not attention seeking at all. And you can tell because people hide it. And Amy Chandler has this great analysis of what that means. What it means is that you're a good self-harmer so long as you don't ever tell anybody. And the second you tell anybody, then even if what you're just saying is, I do this, you're attention seeking now. So it's a tricky double bind. I'm mindful of time and I wanted to get to Alice's, if that's all right.
Yeah, there's also.
Oh, wow. Okay, brilliant. I'll try and be fast. I will
read out the question because I don't think it'll get.
Well, I will try and summarize. Alice asked a really great question about Sophie versus Effie from Skins, where Effie's self-harm indirectly causes harm to the people who care about her. That is certainly the case, and yet is an idealized expression of adolescent rage and misunderstanding, and Effie being a key cultural figure. Alice, that's a question after my own heart. Effie was an extremely key cultural figure to me and also to every like white girl on Tumblr in 2009, which was really my space. So really Effie, very important to us all. I think that the interesting thing that shifts around there, the critique that people made in my study a lot about Effie is that she glamorized self-harm. And I think that this is in some way an interesting flip side to some of the things I was trying to think about in this paper. is that there is a version of self-harm where, rather than the sort of like awkwardness, embarrassment that like Kristen Stewart and Sophie are really playing into, that you get the kind of like really glamorous, like, is it Susan Sontag who talks about illness as interesting? I think that's who I usually cite, that like, it's the like, oh, I'm so thin and I'm so fragile and I'm so sad. I am very interesting and also I need saving very badly. And like, that is, the pull of that is huge. Where it comes into shame, I think, is double. The first is that it creates this ideal version. And in the same way, a bit as a recovery narrative, it kind of means that then you have an ideal of self-harm to live up to. And that if you, for instance, are self-harming and you are not as fashionable as Effie, and you don't wear ripped tights as effortlessly, and you don't have two separate boys fighting over you, you are like you're very bad at self-harm. You're really doing this wrong. And that is very shaming. And then on the flip side, I think people felt that portrayal. They felt the shame of the glamour. And this is a bit in the paper, but I cut for time. The implication of like, what you're actually trying to do when you self-harm is be like Effie. And that's really embarrassing that you think you have to try to be cool and glamorous like Effie and you're doing it via self-harm. This accusation that like teenage girls are just imitating the supposedly cool figures they see on TV and they can't separate out like aesthetic coolness from self-harm. And I think that really is A, a shaming narrative, and B, deeply underestimates and misunderstands teenage girls who watch TV, who I think were really able to separate how fashionable Effie was from the fact that she was self-harming. I hope that kind of answers your question. I'm going to try really fast to answer it. Theonulas, whose name I had not pronounced correctly. I think it's lovely to see you both. Sorry. You were interested in the point that the shame of self-harm is reinforced through the narrative structure with the emphasis on secrecy. Did participants find this to be somehow realistic and therefore helpful in a sense because it reflected their own experience with secrecy? Or does this merely reinforce the necessity for secrecy/shame? I think a bit of both. One of the things that is a bit true across the whole study is that like, everything was two things at once. There was almost nothing that everybody universally agreed on. And it's interesting, I've just finished up, I'm finishing up a project about anxiety, wherein the function of secrecy becomes to be really important. Like lots of people talked about how important how inaccurate it was to show anxiety is really obvious when their experience was that anxiety was really hidden and they worked really hard to keep it hidden, and like no narrative was giving them credit for how hard they were working to like manage all their anxiety really secretly. And that felt really important and interesting. I would say, and it's a small sample size, so I don't draw any like broad conclusions. I would say that slightly more people like had this identification of secrecy being a bit tricky, and that what a lot of people found most helpful was representations of self-harm wherein there was some sort of sociality around self-harm. And sometimes that was like quite the straightforward sort of, somebody talked really movingly about a book where a teenager talked to her teacher about her self-harm, and her teacher got her help by going to the GP. And she said she had seen that and it made her feel like she could do it. And she talked to her teacher and got help and went to her GP. And that was incredibly moving to hear that, to hear the difference that she felt like seeing that in fiction had made in her life. And other people talked in a bit more of an abstract way, less like, I saw this, I did this, but more like that one of the things that's hard about self-harm is having conversations around it. It's just hard to talk about in a like everyday, this is happening way. We can have the conversation where somebody discovers it and is shocked and is upset. But any conversation that isn't that is really hard. So I think that even if it wasn't very realistic, actually, participants felt like it was very meaningful to be able to have to be able to see any kind of conversation that wasn't just somebody having discovered self-harm and being very cross and upset. yeah, I hope that makes some kind of sense and answers your question a little bit. I am mindful that I've gone over time. Sorry, Catherine.
No worries at all. I think we'll have to leave it there, even though I'm sure that there's so much more. I mean, I know certainly I could ask Veronica, but yeah, just want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you again in another seminar. And to just say, yeah, I hope you would all join me in saying a really big thank you to Veronica, because that was such a wonderful talk. I feel really lucky to have got to listen to it. Thank you, Veronica.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
We meet next time for